How is the screening process? I mean, it sounds like obviously a lot of these individuals are going through something personally. That's what I noticed when I was doing HUD Vash. Like I'm working with homeless veterans, and there's a reason they're homeless. Like they're going through something that caused the homelessness. So it was, a different sort of screening process when I was working with them than it would be a typical tenant. So what did that look like for you with these type of properties?
Yeah. So the reality is, like up in Dallas, I started doing, the Section 8 program up there. And what I quickly realized was that credit checks and your normal stereotypical screening process, I mean, throw it out the window. It's not even worth it, right? Because these people are going to have 450, 550 credit scores. You can't go down the traditional path. The main screening process that I look for, I don't want any axe murderers, right? So none of that stuff. I don't want any violent criminals, none of that.
Oh, I think you went on mute there.
Something along those lines. Sorry, that was a phone call coming in. Yeah, I'd be willing to take you, because the other thing is that I knew, number one, that these people needed a place to stay. Number two, I knew that they had guaranteed income, right? So every month they're getting a check for $1,500. I'm charging them $550 back then. So that was, to me, that was always the most critical element. If I'm renting out to your standard client, do they have a job? How long have they been at their job? And how, then I would look at the industry, where's this industry going? For these people, they're getting money direct from the government. So I knew that it's not going anywhere other than in an apocalyptic scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, it cut out right when you said the main thing that you look at for them was what?
The main thing that I look at normally for just regular tenants is going to be their job history and their ability to pay.
Yeah.
Right. For these people, I didn't have to worry about that because they're getting payments direct from the government, right? Every month they're getting a check for, $1,500.
Yeah. Got it.
I was paying them $550, or I was charging them $550. So.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So from a standpoint of, are you going to get paid as the owner of the property or the landlord, on a monthly basis, that component makes a lot of sense. From the component of, how do you know that they're not going to, rock star your place when they get in there and you're going to have all kinds of problems with them? Is there any way to screen that, or how do you, I guess, prevent some of those issues, or what have you learned over the years?
Yeah. So the beauty with running and operating more like assisted living, group homes, transitional houses, whatever you want to refer to them as, is that you've got an on-site manager. And when I say on-site, they're living in the house, right? Versus if you're running Section 8 properties, I still have Section 8 tenants living in houses that I haven't seen for 5 or 6 years. Like the maintenance guys will go over there and like, man, this place is destroyed, right? Versus over at the group homes, you've got somebody that's living there, and then your manager's in and out every single day, delivering food, maybe working with home health, so on and so forth. So it is operationally intensive. But the good thing about that is that you're there all the time. So, these people they don't really have the ability to start destroying things because you're there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's the big difference, I think, for any investing, like how often you're able to get your eyes on it, or your manager can get their eyes on it and just monitor things. It's kind of crazy how quickly things can deteriorate if you don't do that. So that's great. So say again?
They can deteriorate very fast.
Yeah.
If I could cut in here real quick, because I'm working with all of our students, right? So I manage all of our coaching clients that are doing very similar. It's the same business model that Andy does, but everybody kind of has their own touch to it. So a lot of people will put cameras in the properties. The house supervisors are typically just trustworthy tenants, and then the beauty of like the way that you market and network is you're not just taking people in from like apartments.com or like people that saw a billboard. you're typically working directly with a caseworker.
Absolutely.
So they'll kind of give you like the profile of the person. If there are issues with the tenants, you're typically going to be working directly with the caseworker, and they'll try to handle it. So that's basically, I think that's kind of like the screening process, more or less. It's totally different. So you're not going by an application and like a credit report. You're typically working with a caseworker or someone at like the social service organization, and
right.
And you also,
and you're getting deposits off these people as well, and they're not necessarily coming from them. They're coming from these governmental agencies. So you might get a triple deposit. So that incentivizes you to, to put them into your property.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I noticed as well with the HUD Vash. It was like, you're taking on a bit more risk, quote unquote, like, because they don't meet the traditional profile, but at the same time, you can put things in place because financially it was a bit better in terms of, your income. So you could put things in place to kind of mitigate some of that risk. So speaking of that, then what do the financials look like on a property, a typical, maybe there's not a typical group home, but on what you generally see?
It's pretty typical. Yeah, pretty typical the way that we run them. So my model all along was like, I would take like a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with a 2-car garage. And obviously it depends on the city that you're in. I mean, once the cities start gentrifying, it's a little bit more difficult to do this. But if you're buying in C areas, what I would, and this is always my model, I would convert the garages. So the garages would be converted. Then I would have a 5-bedroom, 2-bath. Okay. With 2 people to a room typically. So you'd have 10 beds. And so that's kind of how I looked at everything. I've got 10 beds, and 20 years ago, I'm charging $550 a month. So you can kind of do the math. And then it's your overhead. What's your overhead on that? Well, if you're buying a $60,000 house, and this is why, I've always been a proponent of buying in these C areas, $60,000 homes are hard to come by now, right? But even you can still probably buy $100,000 homes depending on the city that you're in C areas, $125,000 homes. But yeah, you got your mortgage, you got your taxes, you got your insurance, you've got your business insurance, and then everyone's a little bit different, but we always provided food. And those are your expenses, and you got your utilities as well. And when I say your utilities, I'm not just talking electric and water and gas. I'm also referring to like telephone, Netflix, things like that. But it's minimal, right? So normally you're running, call it 50% margins when it's all said and done. And so if you've got $5,000 coming in, you got $2,500 going out. That's your spread.
On a $60,000 property, I know the investors out there are probably pulling out the calculator. Andy, how do you calculate the ROI on these things?
Yeah, I don't, right? I mean, if it takes a calculator to figure out if it's a good deal, it's not a good deal.
Boom.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I've always been. And look, things have definitely gotten more competitive. I'm gonna drive forward a little bit because it looks like this guy's going behind. Things have gotten more competitive here, so you might have to pay a little bit more. But again, when you were asking me earlier on, Kirby, like what are you spending your time doing? I'm like, man, I'm driving because I'm looking for stuff all the time. So you got to go into different markets eventually, like if the prices get too expensive.
Yeah. And to your point, like, the numbers are so good that even if you're paying a little bit more, like if you're financing on a 30-year loan and you pay them $50,000 more, so instead of it being 60,000, it's 110,000, or even 150,000, like the difference in terms of that expense on a monthly basis compared to what you're bringing in with those types of numbers, pretty minimal. You're not doing it probably for the equity as much as just really phenomenal cash flow, it sounds like.
Yeah, the cash flow is phenomenal. And look, I mean, I'll be the first to admit I got a little bit lucky, right? Because I started doing this a long time ago, and interest rates, as I was alluding to, my first loan was at 8.5%. Interest rates went from, it's just like the real estate market's the bond market, right? So it went from 8.5% when I first started buying in 2000 to what were interest rates last year? Like 3%. I mean, you probably might have been able to get a 2.95% interest loan.
Mm-hmm.
So the prices have skyrocketed over the last 20 years, which is, it's been good, and the rents have gone up. And the next thing you know, it's not just cash flow, but it's a lot of equity in these properties as well. And, then you can start doing some stuff with that as well.
Yeah. And I'm curious on, like, so with 10 people in a property, I would imagine some people it's like very temporary type of housing for them. Some people it's maybe they're planning to stay there for the long term, but there's a lot of, I would guess, turnover. How is that managed?
Look, the way that we really looked at doing everything, we're building families, right? I mean, so each house was literally like a family. So we'd be like, all right, and it's all male and all female. We're not mixing anybody.
Okay.
Then what we would do is we'd be, your ideal tenant is going to be, I would say elderly, because they're just going to stay, and that's what you're looking for. So I mean, look, I think at the very beginning I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but we were probably averaging a 8-month stay, something like that. But we've gotten it now, and I am scaling these things down at this point, just because frankly the property taxes have gotten too expensive, and so I need to start moving the equity. But up until probably like 2015, I mean we were having people stay probably on average 1.5 to 2 years, and we'd had people that had been with us for since I started it.
I see. Okay. And with like financing on a property like this, you can get just, traditional, either conventional financing or DSCR loans. There's no like special financing required or anything like that.
Look, you can go. I remember when you couldn't get any money, right? 2008, which, that's when I kind of cleaned up with all this stuff. I think half the reason why I was able to go out and buy the real estate was because all the banks had been shut down on their 1 to 4 unit portfolios. They're like, the FDIC, the OCC was like, you guys aren't lending on this stuff anymore. And I remember one of my bankers, he's like, Andrew, you're running businesses out of these things. We can get you business loans. We can get you SBA financing, which I never did, or we can put it into our business loan portfolio, right? So these are two totally separate buckets. So it's an owner occupied business loan, right?
Wow.
Yeah. Got it.
Interesting.
Yes, exactly. So it makes sense. You're running basically like an assisted living, transitional home, whatever you want to refer to it as. And I always say whatever you want to refer to it as, because when you're out there talking to your debt partners and the lenders, if you're like, yeah, I'm running group homes, they may not like the way that sounds, right? Mm-hmm. But if you go to them and you say, I'm running, care homes, which is really how I always refer to everything. It's a little bit more palatable.
Got it.
And but anyways, yeah, that's how we did it,
Yeah. So it sounds like you've got so much optionality. It's almost like the best of all worlds. And then in terms of like the tenants, then if there's a issue, you're not necessarily going through a regular eviction process, right? Or is that?
We're not okay. At all. The reason for that is, like, think about if you go over and you stay at the Hilton Hotel or whatever, and you overstay your welcome. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
a big security guard is going to show up and bang on the door.
You got it. So that's kind of how we operate everything. Looking back on it, I'm trying to think if we ever, look, you're going to get some. It's just the law of numbers. I mean, if you house a couple thousand people over a 5-year period or 10-year period, you're going to get some bad apples. And I think that now that I think about, I'll tell you guys an interesting story. In fact, Brandon probably remembers this, and this is probably 2 years ago. It was during COVID. So we did have this issue during COVID. And this one guy who was just, I don't know, you were asking about screening earlier on. We probably did a bad job screening this guy. And anyways, this guy basically drove out everybody in the property. So, the place probably had 8-9 people in it. And he was such a lunatic that we couldn't get rid of him for whatever reason. And I think he wound up getting, again, a lot of it boils down to the city that you're in, right? So he wound up getting one of the local nonprofit attorneys, and he stayed in that property for, probably 18 months without making payments. Ooh. Granted, this is during COVID. And eventually we did have to go in front of a judge to get him out. So, but most of the time, it's like, hey, pack your bags, you're out of here. And we're just, we lock them out.
I see. Okay. So he was almost just like a squatter or something
He
like
was,
that.
yeah, he basically was a squatter. And again, it was during COVID, and
Yeah.
we were dealing with all those issues. Now, again, it all depends on the county that you're in.